Welcome to the Healing Place podcast, a space filled with inspirational stories of hope, along with practical advice for your healing journey. Your host is Teri Wellbrock, trauma warrior, writer, speaker, blogger, therapy dog handler, and founder of the Sammy's Bundles of Hope project. As a survivor and a thriver, Teri's mission is to shine the light of hope into the world by interviewing insightful guests from across the globe. Please stay tuned at the end of today's interview as we honor our sponsors. The Healing Place podcast is a fiscally sponsored project of Fractured Atlas. Now, here's your host and trauma warrior, Teri Wellbrock.
Welcome, everybody, to the Healing Place podcast. I'm your host, Teri Wellbrock, and very excited to have with me today Dr. William T. Kenny, and he is a radiologist, but also author of The Conscious Whole, which is an award-winning book, novel. And we're going to dive into that and talk about what it's about and a lot of other wonderful subjects, quantum physics and the conscious whole, global consciousness. So welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
So I'm a radiologist. I write under the pen name William T. Kenny. My real name is William T. Randazzo. And as a radiologist, what I do is so I'm a doctor. I went to medical school and did 6 years of basically advanced training after medical school. And what we do as radiologists, we read X-rays, CTs, MRIs, ultrasounds. We also do minimally invasive procedures with X-ray guidance. And during the course of my training, I learned about physics and also had an interest in physics before pursuing radiology. And when I was in medical school, I was learning about DNA and the nucleotides in DNA, these little tiny small molecules. And with my kind of interest in physics, I was thinking about how physicists study the small particles, the subatomic particles, atoms and protons and electrons, and the laws of physics those follow. And generally speaking, you kind of, put those into the category of following quantum physics. And a lot of people have probably heard about quantum physics, and it's essentially the study and the science of the very small things in nature. So you're talking atoms, small molecules, protons, and the parts of those atoms as well. And the laws of physics they obey are very strange when you put them in the context of our everyday life. And they don't really make sense. And there are a couple reasons they might not make sense. They might not make sense because we don't understand that world completely, which is probably the most true statement you can make. We don't really understand it. We don't know what it's doing, but those particles do very strange things. And so when I'm sitting in my medical school class, this was more than 10 years ago, learning about DNA, and they're talking about the nucleotides in DNA, these little tiny parts of DNA that basically determine the code. And that code determines what our bodies look like and how they function, and disease and health and everything that we kind of know about the body. And we describe them in medicine as being these permanent fixed pieces of matter that are inside of our DNA. But when you read the quantum physics literature, they describe little tiny particles as being not fixed, as being potentials, and being things that could be both there and not there, and things, that can exist in many states. And so it's hard to put those two theories together, because on one hand, we're describing DNA as being permanent, fixed, and if you have a genetic illness, that genetic illness you're born with, it's with you your whole life, and then you die with it, and it has certain manifestations. But a quantum physicist might look at the particle and say, well, that particle is really only there because we are observing it to be there, which is one of the most interesting parts of quantum physics. How can you observe something being one way, and then you look at it another way and it looks different, or it's in a different location? And there's some really interesting experimental tests that have been done in physics where you can look at one little particle, and that particle could exist in two locations at once.
Wow.
Now that doesn't make sense.
No.
Right? We don't look at a person and say that person's in two places at once. They're only in one place. And so there's no congruence between how we see our macro world and how the tiny world works. And it's so what I did is I wrote a book. It's called The Conscious Whole, and I started writing it in medical school, and it took about maybe 7 or 8 years to finish. And what I try to do is I try to bring these two theories together. How do you bring the theories of quantum physics into that of medicine? Now, I'm formally trained in medicine. I'm not a physicist, but I have an interest in physics, and that's kind of what brought me to try to bring these two worlds together. And there are a number of theories in the more traditional literature as to why we think the quantum world behaves strangely in the small setting, but not in the macro setting that we're used to in our day in, day out. But nobody really knows. And some of the explanations are even very strange. And, one of the explanations is called the many worlds theory, meaning that at any given point, you're driving down the street, you can turn left or turn right. And let's say you choose to turn left, and that's your world, that's your reality. You've turned left at that intersection. But in the many worlds theory, those both worlds exist. So there's the world where you turn left and the world where you turn right, and those kind of branch off into separate universes. And then that happens at every intersection, not only when you're driving, but in life and with every iteration of matter. And so you can imagine that creates essentially an infinite number of universes, and we're kind of only experiencing one as far as we can tell. And that's a very strange way to understand the world, but that's one explanation. And so the idea of the conscious whole and the book that I wrote is, how do you bring those strange laws into health? And what does it mean when you're a doctor and you're studying medicine, you're primarily studying disease, and you're primarily just studying how do we fix disease? How do we make it better? How do we help people? Right. How do we heal people? And how do we cure people? And I think some of those theories in physics can help guide us in a certain direction to perhaps help us understand the body better and help us understand reality a little better.
Yeah, fascinating. For just a moment, I thought about those deja vu moments, and you wonder, is that when like the worlds cross, and you're like, have I been here before? Have I done this before?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it is true. And so that's the kind of interesting thing. We experience these really kind of subtle things in the world, and when you don't have an explanation for it, you can just say, oh, it's just some weird thing. My neurons are firing off weird in my brain, causing me to feel that way.
Right.
That kind of deja vu feeling. And it is strange when you have deja vu. And,
oh, yeah.
If you don't have an explanation for it, if we don't have science to say deja vu is X, Y, or Z, you can kind of just shrug it off and say, well, it's whatever. It's just something random. But we often do that in science when something doesn't fit our paradigm. We often say, oh, that's just, an aberrant data point. You kind of throw it out. But some of the most interesting things are these aberrant data points. And I think sometimes it might speak to a reality that we really don't quite understand.
Yeah. Fascinating. Wow. So yes, so your book is about really the story of someone who experiences a journey through this, right?
Yeah, exactly. So when I was in medical school, I worked in an ALS clinic, so Lou Gehrig's disease called amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and it's a progressive neurodegenerative disease whereby your neurons essentially fail, and we have no good treatment for it. It's essentially a terminal illness, and it's a fairly heterogeneous disease in the spectrum of how it presents. And when I was working in this clinic, I saw all these patients and that were suffering from this disease. And this was right at the time when I was starting to write the book. And so I gained a lot of inspiration from those patients and kind of incorporated that kind of disease and that identity and what was going on with them into the book. And so the main character is a gentleman named Andy, who is essentially a fictional character, but the idea in the story is based on people that I had seen in clinic. And so he has a terminal illness, and in the book it's kind of a made-up illness, so we don't have to get into specifics of it, and he's diagnosed, and then he kind of goes on this journey of trying to discover the world. And so I incorporate some of the ideas of quantum physics into it and try to figure out, how can he change? How can he get healed? And how could he, is it a terminal illness? And if his DNA is telling his body to do one thing, if DNA is not fixed and not permanent, as in quantum physics we might say, then is his disease fixed and permanent? And so the book is essentially kind of a dissertation on that. Is disease fixed? Is it permanent? And, how can we try to, improve that, for other people that have kind of similar conditions?
Right. Well, and you hear these stories often where you just said, is disease permanent, where someone gets a horrible terminal diagnosis of brain cancer or whatever it may be, whatever disease. And whether they say it was through the power of prayer or whether they say it was through, the fact that they started to do more holistic and in fueling their body in different ways. And I had a friend who had cancer, and so she talked about, like the bone marrow soups that she would make, and she started to just incorporate a lot of really healthy supplements, and then she was able to beat it. She was given a pretty scary diagnosis, and so yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting. And one of the most fascinating parts is probably one of that kind of concept of kind of mind-body medicine concept is the placebo effect. And the placebo effect is so strong that we actually use it in clinical trials, right? If you have a medicine that you're testing, you want to make sure it's better than the placebo, because the placebo can have a positive effect. And I think that is, some of the strongest evidence that shows how strong our perception is on our body and our reality. And if you think you're taking a medicine that's good for you, you actually do better, which is, I find that it's, something you kind of take for granted now, saying, oh, this pill is better than placebo. Well, but what about the placebo? It's amazing that a placebo works, that, kind of shows you how strong that is and how strong that effect is. And so I tend to look at this stuff from a very kind of scientific perspective. And I think that, some of the other things we do in more alternative medicine, certainly have merit. And, finding out what has merit and, why they work, I think is really important, as opposed to try to just say, oh, well, let's just kind of go down the, only the traditional route. But that being said, too, the other side of it is that traditional medicine has done a lot of amazing things, too. And I think kind of the future of medicine is trying to incorporate, the best practices and what the best approach is for treating disease. But the placebo effect is strong. And I think it's interesting when you put it in the form of, how we view quantum physics. And so one of the parts of quantum physics is the observer effect. And just to kind of, it's a very complicated topic, so just to kind of briefly summarize it, for the audience, essentially by observing something, by being a scientist and measuring something like, let's say, an electron, you are having an effect on that. So an electron, let's say in an orbit of an atom, can exist in many different states and many different positions. And it's essentially a probability function of where it could exist. There are certain areas where it's more likely to exist, and that's where you're more likely to find it. According to quantum physics, that particle is going to exist in every state possible until you observe it. So it's called a superposition of states. So the electron is essentially many, many positions at the same time, one electron, but until you make a measurement and interact with that system in some way, meaning observe it and measure it with your experimental devices, then it goes into that one state. So it's that, in a way, it's kind of that perception or that interaction with the system that seems to be affecting the reality of that system. And there's a famous thought experiment that I talk about in the book. It's called Schrodinger's cat. Dr. Schrodinger was a physicist, quantum physicist from the early 1900s, and proposed this thought experiment, which was actually he made as a kind of a joke because he didn't really believe that quantum physics was the way that it was being described. And the idea of the thought experiment is that you take a cat and you put it in a box. And unfortunately for the cat, you design an experiment where the cat's going to die when poison is released. And that poison will be released at a random time. And you don't know when the poison will be released. So you put the cat in the box, you close the box, and you can't see inside the box. And you have your device set up to release the poison at a random time. So the question is, when is the cat dead? And the answer in terms of quantum physics is the cat is both alive and dead at the same time. It's existing in two states until you open the box and look inside, and then you can see, is the cat alive or dead? And so the funny thing is that when you do experiments on tiny particles, you observe that very similar effect. You can see an electron in two spots at one time. So that's one electron in two spots at once, until you start to interact with the system, meaning you start to observe it and you start to try to figure out where it is. And then that electron goes to one spot. And so, kind of the question that I have is what happens in our bodies, because our bodies are essentially made of these small little atoms, right? Our DNA is made of these tiny little particles called nucleotides that are, essentially make the code of our DNA. And those nucleotides are just, atoms put together. And so if atoms in experiments act in strange ways, do atoms in our bodies act in similarly strange ways?
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of the question of the heart of, what I was trying to figure out, and kind of the question of the book.
Right. Wow. Well, first off, I'm sad for the cats in those experiments.
Yeah.
My heart was like,
in real life,
oh.
and so it's a thought experiment, so we can leave it for that.
And then second, I think I remember reading something or seeing videos or something. There was a scientist, a doctor, doing some experiments, maybe in Japan, somewhere in Asia, where it was like on snowflakes or water and people even just like thinking angry thoughts or happy thoughts and the impact that it was having on these. And I was so fascinated by it. I don't know if it was ever debunked or whatever, but to me, what you're talking about is kind of the same, but you're talking about not so much altering it or changing it, but just by observing it, you're almost like freezing it in time or.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's right. And so that's kind of the mystery of it. And if you talk to a quantum physicist, someone who's formally trained in it, and you start kind of talking about how your perceptions affect reality, they're going to kind of scoff you off and say that's crazy. That's really not how it works. And there's probably some truth to that as well, because the one thing we just don't really understand it yet enough,
Right.
And that's why we have these really crazy theories like the multiverse, meaning that you have multiple universes that are created at every branching point, and that's an accepted theory among legitimate physicists in that area of study. And so there's probably a couple of things that work. Probably one of them is we don't understand it completely, and so our modeling is incomplete of how this works. But also it is kind of the interaction of that system. And so what we have to do in these experiments is you set up somewhat artificial circumstances where you have one electron isolated, and one electron doesn't exist in an isolated system, right? All of our electrons are all interacting with everything else around them. And it seems to be that interaction of kind of larger groups of molecules and particles that create something called, in physics, they call it decoherence, meaning that if you take one electron and you observe it, it might behave in really funny ways. It might be in multiple places at once. But if you take a bigger and bigger group of electrons and put them together, they don't behave in that funny way. And then you expand it out, and then you have things like our bodies, which are, a massive number of electrons together, and we don't behave in that strange way. And it's probably because you have multiple interactions. So the systems are not isolated, right? We don't exist by ourselves in the universe. Electrons don't exist by themselves in the universe. It's just, everything's kind of connected and existing together. And so it's that connection that seems to create the reality that we experience every day.
Wow.
And so that kind of dovetails into another part of the book, the idea of the conscious whole. And what is the conscious whole? And so, I kind of outlined this process of going from these kind of weird theories in physics and how do they make sense on the larger scale of our bodies and maybe the larger scale of our society or our universe. And so the idea of the conscious whole is kind of this large system interacting with everything else. And what does that mean? And so, obviously you can't just pick how you want, how your body is every day. If you have a disease, you can't wake up and say, today I'm healthy, and your body changes that way. It doesn't seem to work that way, even though we do have the placebo effect, which seems to be very strong. There are a lot of other players interacting. There's a lot of other systems, there are a lot of other factors. And that's the idea of the conscious whole, is this collective consciousness. So if I have a way that I observe the world in my own conscious experience, and then somebody across the other side of the earth has their own way they observe it, we might be separate and observe our worlds in different ways. But if we're living together, you have to have kind of a similar reality in order to function, right? We have to kind of obey the same laws and the same rules of physics. I can't just fly through the air, because that's not how it works, right? And so the conscious whole is the effect of all these consciousnesses together, creating a reality that we all kind of accept and believe in.
Yeah. As you were talking before we took a little shift into the conscious whole when you were talking about particles. I was thinking about in isolation, you were talking about they behave one way, but as you gather more and more and more of them, such as like a whole human body, they respond differently. They act differently. And that's so really kind of true of us as humans. And that's why my head was going, so now what you're talking about makes total sense is, how we connect together changes really kind of how we respond, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's exactly right. You can kind of see that on the macro level too. You see that on, how crowds behave together and how mobs behave and how societies behave, and we all kind of, follow a certain set of norms, and sometimes those norms are good and sometimes they're bad, and so it's kind of in some sense a psychological effect, but maybe a physical effect as well.
Okay, awesome. So let's pull trauma into this and talk about how it correlates with the conscious whole.
Yeah, and so you can kind of relate that maybe in some ways if you think about the placebo effect, how your mind affects your body, and the placebo effect is generally in a good way, right? You're taking a pill because you think it's good for you, but if if your mental state is not positive, right? If something happens to you traumatically, either physically or emotionally, um, or in your family or whatever, that's going to affect you in a negative way. So it's almost like a negative placebo effect, right? It's doing the opposite. It's hurting your body. It's not helping you. And so I think that's kind of if you can boil down what that effect is on your body, as a physician, I'm interested in how it affects our body, right? How we see a lot of patients with diseases, and I think a lot of diseases, not in all cases, but in many cases, are manifestations of our life. Either it's because you didn't take care of your body and you smoked or didn't exercise and didn't eat well, and that's going to have a negative effect on your body. And maybe it's an emotional state or a mental state that's going to have a negative effect on your body, or maybe a traumatic state that has a negative effect on your body. And so you can see the manifestations in disease processes, even physical disease processes. And so I think trauma kind of plays, partly that role as well. And it's another mind-body connection, I think.
Yeah. Well, I talk a lot about adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, on the show, and the impact, from studies that have shown how growing up in poverty or having abuse as a child or neglect, all of those things has such a profound impact, especially if you score multiple adverse childhood experiences, multiple ACEs, on future physical health, mental health. I mean, suicidology goes up crazy, and heart disease and diabetes and all of these things it jumps the higher your ACEs score is. Yeah.
Yeah, it really is. I think an area, because in medicine, at least in traditional medicine, and you tend to look at the physical body and say if the patient has heart disease, and why do they have heart disease? Well, because of the physiological conditions in their body, right? Or why is the patient suicidal? And well, it's because of something, and we'll put them on medication, or we'll do this or that, and we don't often take into account the the kind of macro picture of what their childhood was like, or what their home life is like, and what their life is like. And that kind of stress on the body has profound effects. It decreases your immune system, increases your cancer risk, and all these really terrible things. And the one thing I kind of hint at, maybe more than hint at in the book, is how strong these perceptions of the world are, not only on reality. And that's kind of to bring what we're talking about, the physical world, or the world of physics, or the world of the particles, is that kind of interaction with the particle affects the reality of that particle, right? And so your interaction, your kind of mental or your mind interaction with your body and with your reality is going to affect it in physical ways and create physical manifestations of disease.
Yeah. Well, in your book, Andy, he goes down a path of like alternative sort of healing, right? And is he able to then shift what is happening in his body?
Yeah, and so that's kind of so he kind of goes through this process of leaving the conscious whole. So the conscious whole you can kind of think as like, it's a bit like the conscious soul in the book is a bit negative. That's kind of how it's portrayed. It's this thing that's bad, but in reality it's not particularly bad. It's just kind of the way it is, right? And so he leaves this conscious whole and finds a new area and finds a different group of people that kind of look at the world in a different way. And in doing so, he's able to see that his disease actually for him is not something that's unalterable, something that's genetic, but something that he created. Something that, and actually based on a traumatic experience that he had in the past, and in that story of the book. And so that traumatic experience kind of essentially manifested in disease and created this genetic state in his body that the people in the conscious soul saw, and they said, well, you have a genetic disease, but in fact it was all based upon a traumatic event that he had in his past. And so he works through that and kind of sees that and is able to kind of restore his health. And then he goes back into the conscious whole to try to show people what he's done. And that's, where the story gets pretty interesting.
Oh my gosh, I can't wait. I'm so excited. I love this. I mean, I so relate to him because funny how, as you talked, talking about the conscious whole, in my brain was thinking about the conscious whole of like, as people are starting to come to light and starting to understand more, because I've moved from the conscious whole that you're talking about of the negative world and having this one mindset of approaches towards things to, because of all these interviews I've done and the research I've done. And so I'm over here now, I'm where Andy moved to.
Yeah.
So that's where I was going to. And I was thinking about as you first started talking, but yeah, that's wonderful. That's just amazing.
Yeah. So the idea of the conscious soul could be anything. And it's agnostic in a sense to, any good or bad. And the idea of good and bad, I think, is a very interesting philosophical discussion that, we kind of save for another day. But, the conscious soul could be good or it could be bad, or it could just be neutral. It essentially what it is it's the aggregation of all the consciousnesses that are, within it. And that's how it's created. And, it's up to the people to determine what the conscious soul is. And I think that's kind of the neat part of it, where Andy comes from, and just at least in the story of the book, the conscious soul is not working in his favor. It's bad, at least for him and under his perception. But, where he essentially goes to a new space, and that conscious whole there is, I don't call it the conscious whole in the book, but it's a new area of consciousness, and, that is more positive for him. And then he tries to go back and change it. And so it's really, something that we create. And it's an interesting, another facet of the book that was a lot of fun to write about and a lot of fun to kind of explore, what it means to have this global consciousness and how does it affect our reality and how we behave. And I think we see that a lot, particularly nowadays, with how connected we are to everyone else. And I think that's kind of the interesting thing with, social media in a way. It's this connection that we've created across the world to people that's instantaneous, and we don't know how to deal with it.
Right.
We're kind of seeing the turmoil of that now. We don't know how to deal with having everybody's thoughts, instantly accessible.
Yeah. Well, and again, as you talked, I instantly, like, as you spoke, I was thinking enlightenment. Like, it's almost like he had enlightenment and went back into humanity with this enlightenment. And again, what you said about we control as a species, as humans, this conscious whole. The more that become enlightened, the more enlightened the conscious whole becomes.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah.
And that's what he does. And that's kind of, the story of the book is that he goes back and he tries to change it. And he tries to show them what he learned and to make it better. And he's ultimately successful. There's a lot of twists and turns in that.
Yeah. Awesome. I love it. All right. So anything else that you wanted to dive into that we haven't had a chance to talk about?
Let's see. I think we've covered most of those.
Our talking points. Yeah, we did. Yeah. Awesome. So how do people find you? How do they find the book?
Yeah, sure. The book's on Amazon and on Barnes & Noble. You can also go on my website, it's, theconscioussoul.com or williamtkenny.com. You can find the book there and links to, buy it on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and whatnot. and also indie bound too. So there's a supplier of bookstores that hold the book. It's in Kindle and paperback format. I have an email contract on my website, so you can send me an email, any questions.
Awesome.
And yeah, it's just fun to talk about. It's an interesting concept, and I think the whole point of the book is that we can affect change in the world in positive ways. And sometimes you think you can't do it because you're just one person. But you think of some people that were only one person that changed the world too. Martin Luther King, Gandhi. Those were just one. It was just one person that has had a profound effects on the world. So.
Yes, absolutely. And I agree wholeheartedly. And I always think of it as that ripple effect as we impact more people. And I lost your video feed for a second.
Oh, I'm there. Coming back in there.
There you are. It's funny because I find hearts everywhere. I find hearts, I'm not kidding, dozens a day. I'll just be walking along and I'll be like, oh, look, a cloud in the sky and it's in the shape of a heart, or a wad of gum on the street and it's in the shape of a heart. And so I'll snap pictures and I pop them out on my Facebook page or social media. And what's happened over the years has just been amazing, because now I have people that will tag me in posts, I would say at least weekly, if not multiple times a week. Hey, Teri, I found this heart today and I thought of you. Hey, Teri, I find hearts all the time now because of you. And so to me, it's just amazing, because my whole hashtag with it was love is all around us. And just to help people be more conscious of, to be aware that love is all around us. And so just snapping a picture of some hearts and putting it out on social media has had this profound impact on so many people. And it makes my heart happy to know that it was simple, but it had an impact.
Yeah. And I think, the point of that I see too is that it's the choice that you have, right? And so, you see hearts because that's how you're seeing the world. And that's, a very positive way to look at it. And you're helping people around you. Unfortunately, there are people too that see negativity in the world.
Right.
And I think, particularly, relating to trauma and traumatic experiences, and I think it could, kind of steer you in a direction where you're only seeing negativity. But I think there's a lot of power in knowing that you can see the world in different ways and you can perceive it in different ways and you can make it positive.
Yeah.
But it's a choice, it's ultimately a choice. It's, how you see the world is how it will be. Right. And are you going to be positive or are you going to be negative? And that not only affects your emotional state and how you're feeling that day, but it also affects your body, physically affects your body. And, I think you have to try to, encourage that in yourself and in the people around you, and try to help people, see the positivity in the world and try to, change it where you can.
Yes, I love that. Absolutely. It made me think of I saw a cute little cartoon once that had like two people riding in a bus on either side. And on one side of the bus was this beautiful view and a sunset in a valley. And then the other one was like they were driving on a cliff wall. And the one was looking out the window and just so dejected and depressed and just looking at that wall. And the other one was just smiling and beaming and like pressed up against the window because so excited to see this beautiful view outside. And it was, like your choice on how you decide to view what's around you.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's, again, there's a lot of power in that, of how you can, just navigate the world.
Yeah. I love it. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me here today on the podcast. It's just been an enlightening, wonderful conversation.
Yeah. Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on the Healing Place podcast. And remember, until next time, be gentle with yourself. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for listening today to the Healing Place podcast with your host and trauma warrior, Teri Wellbrock. If you enjoyed this episode and want to learn more about Teri, her mission, and the Hope for Healing journey, visit Teri's website at www.teriwellbrock.com. Thank you for liking, commenting, sharing, and offering your reviews on our YouTube channel, audio outlets, and Facebook page. And as Teri reminds us, until next time, remember, be gentle with yourself.